It's been a journey with us for the past few months. We've been doing the Gospel of John and looking at sort of how John speaks to us. Remember, John said, I write these things in order that you might believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and that you might have life in His name. That was his thesis. That was his premise. That was his desire. So we spent some time in it. John has been called the Gospel of Belief. I was talking to someone recently that became a Christian as a young adult. And he said, the very first thing I really ever read for myself was the Gospel of John. And he said, it's my favorite book. And I says, well, you chose well. You chose well. So we're sort of wrapping it up today. This is our last lesson in this series from the Gospel of John. And Charles read the text for us this morning, and I'm going to read part of it again. But I guess if you want to think of a title for the lesson this morning, the title, it's personal. It's personal. That best describes it, and as we go through, maybe it'll make a little bit more sense why I chose that title. Let's put the lesson into context. The breakfast is over. They had fish and bread for breakfast. We had the dialogue between Jesus and Peter last week, and how Jesus asked Peter, do you remember the phrase, do you agape love me? And Peter says, yes, Lord, I filial love you. And Jesus says, then feed my lambs. And then he said, Peter again, do you agape love me or agapo love me? And Peter says, yes, Lord, you know I filial love you. And, it's that tension between, saying that, telling you someone that you love them and say, yes, I like you too. And that's sort of the tension there in the text. And finally, Jesus chose Peter's word the last time, and do you filial love me? And Peter said, yes, Lord. You know I do. So each time Jesus would commission him, feed my lambs, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. So Peter has been restored, if you will. Following his denial, Jesus has restored him. Jesus has 3 times commissioned him, feed my lambs, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. Now that may be not significant to us, but in that culture, to say something 3 times was very, very important. I remember years ago, I was reading something that said in Saudi Arabia, all a man had to do to divorce his wife to say, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you. And they were divorced. All he did was say it was 3 times and they were divorced. That's all it took in that culture to divorce your wife, was to say it 3 times. So I thought that was odd, but when I read and did a little study for the lesson, I realized that that's sort of the culture there, that if you affirm something 3 times, that makes it true. That makes it so. So Jesus 3 times commissions Peter, feed my lambs, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. So Peter has been commissioned. He's been restored. And as we said last week, it was awkward to have all that attention on you. We don't like to be the center of attention sometimes. To have it be confronted, so to speak, and right in your face. And we sort of continue that same thing this morning as Jesus continues to talk to Peter and John. The breakfast is over. The fire is dying down. And Jesus needs to ensure Peter that he knows what he's committed himself to. Remember, in the text, as Charles read this morning, Jesus goes back to that same language he did when he first called Peter from his fishing business, when he said, follow me. And Jesus comes again. This is 3 years later. Everything's happened. And he's still saying, follow me. But he needs Peter to understand what follow me means. And I will be real honest with you. John chapter 21 is probably one of my least favorite chapters in John, because it's confusing to me. I've read it and studied it over the years, and maybe in recent, I've got a little bit clearer understanding of it, because the language doesn't flow well for me. The reading doesn't flow well. And I've heard it preached different ways, and I want to share with you this morning sort of what I think's happened here in this text. Most assuredly said to you that when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished, but when you're old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish. This he spoke, signifying by what death he, that is Peter, would die, would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, follow me. That was the invitation Jesus made over 3 years ago when he said, follow me. And they left their nets, and Peter left and followed with his brother and became disciples of Jesus. But we have this, and it seems to be a little bit of a downer. Jesus says, when you're a young man, you can do whatever you want to do. But when you're old, other people do things to you. They'll take you places you don't want to go and do things you don't want done. And then John says that Jesus said this coded prophetic message almost as a way to tell Peter, here's how you're going to die. Here's how you're going to die. This was a few months ago now, Tammy, she was on her iPad one night. She said, this is the neatest little quiz I took. And I said, what is it? She says, well, you answer this series of questions and it predicts your age. It tells you what your age is. And so she said, it got my age perfect. It guessed my age. She said, this is wild. She said, you take it. Okay. So I took the same quiz she took. Okay. Got there. It says, congratulations, you're a youthful 62-year-old. Really? It jumped a decade ahead. So there's some foil in their logarithms or whatever, for me at least. 53-year-old. So, 63. The 63. I'll get it right in a minute. So I said I was 63. Okay. None of us like to know our expiration date, really. And this is Jesus telling Peter, here's your expiration date. And this is what it's going to look like. So part of this invitation, again to Peter, remember, he's been restored, commissioned, and now he wants him to commit to it. Follow me, Peter. It's still a personal decision that you make. And this prophecy about Peter is intended to be personal to Peter. Peter feels this. That's why in a few moments he's going to deflect away from it. He feels this. It's a personal decision. And Jesus sort of reviews Peter's life and tells him that in spite of his future condition, he must remain committed. Peter, in spite of what's going to happen to you, you must remain committed. I'm going to tell you what's going to happen, but you must remain committed. Peter's a principal figure in the gospel. Remember Matthew chapter 16? He's the one who says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, listen, there ain't no mortal man's told you this, but my Father in heaven has revealed this to you. And upon that confession, Peter, I'm going to build my church. Peter is very important. And Jesus is making sure that Peter sort of feels the weight of his importance right here. He says, listen, it ain't always going to be easy, but follow me. He has to remain committed. When you are old, you'll stretch out your hands and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish. That's been a somewhat of a dismal picture. And what does it mean? Does it mean just he's going to be old and infirm and frail? Is that what it means? Or does it mean more than that? I think this is one time with historical record. It's not biblical, but historical record may help us to understand this text a little bit better. History tells us that Peter was crucified. That his hands were stretched out. That he was taken to a place where he did not wish. But history tells us he was crucified. In fact, according to early writers, he died in around the same time that Paul did. And during their Nero persecution, somewhere around 68, 67 AD. Origen said that when Peter died, he did not want to be crucified upright. He wanted to be crucified upside down. Because he did not feel he was worthy of dying in the same manner that Jesus died in. That he wanted to be crucified upside down. So he was taken where he did not want to go. His hands were stretched out. This was one artist's rendering, Cavano, I think is his name, of Peter's crucifixion. Remember, Peter's an adult. He's married during Jesus' ministry. He has a mother-in-law. We know Jesus heals a mother-in-law. We don't know about kids or not, but he was married, he has a wife, has a mother-in-law. So he's probably 30-ish, maybe 40-ish at this point in time. He dies in 67, 68 AD, so he's at least in his 60s, if not in his 70s. And by the first century, that was old for a man. And Jesus tells him, you follow me. You follow me. This don't feel too good to Peter. This is heavy, heavy stuff. So Peter, he begins to change the subject a little bit. But we understand that following Jesus is a personal thing. Each one must take up their own cross. Matthew chapter 16, verse 24, then Jesus says to his disciples, anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. You have your own cross to bear. I don't know what it is. It could be the circumstances of your life. It could be the responsibilities you have. It could be the struggles that you have with your own temptations and sin. I don't know what it is, but you have your own personal one to bear. And as a Christian, you must bear it well and fully. Cross-bearing is not a part-time endeavor. You take it up and follow. You don't take it up, put it down, take it up, put it down, take it up, put it down, take it up, put it down. You take up your cross and you follow him. So, this concept of part-time Christianity, that's not biblical. It's something that you do today, on Sunday, and Monday, and Tuesday, and Wednesday, and Thursday, and Friday, and Saturday. It's something, as was brought out this morning, Ray brought out in the Bible study class this morning, is that when you meet someone, they should leave that encounter knowing that you're a Christian. They should not be surprised to see you in church. They should be surprised to not see you in church. So it's not a part-time endeavor. Paul would talk about our faith experience this way in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. For the love of Christ compels us because we judge thus, that if one died for all, then we all died. And he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and rose again. So Paul says it's not a part-time thing. It's not an on-again, off. When you're Christian 24/7. When you're a disciple of Jesus, you're always on. It's not something that you take a vacation from. It's not something you punch a clock and get in and out. You're on always. Paul said, and what motivates us? The love of Jesus. The love of Jesus compels us. It constrains us, I think the old King James says, because of what he did for us. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, during his lifetime, Bonhoeffer was a martyr who died during World War II, sort of refuting Hitler's regime, and he was killed in a concentration camp. But Bonhoeffer would say, when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. So some of that death for Bonhoeffer was literal. I mean, to die as a martyr. For some of us, really all of us, it's a dying to self. We used to sing a song about our relationship with Jesus. We don't sing it here much anymore, but it's some of self and all of thee. And then it would go lyrically that a little bit of me and mostly me and a little bit of you, and it would go eventually all of you and none of me. So that's sort of the call we're to do as Christians, to make Christ our center. Persecution is an indicator that one is cross-bearing. If you say, well, how do I know that I'm really doing the Christian thing right? How do I know that it's really working? And it's about cross-bearing, but how do you know when it's working? I came across something. It was actually in a sermon that John Stott gave at his church in England. This was done before his death. I don't know the date on it, but it was in 2000. He died in 2011. Now, John Stott's not someone I was really familiar with. He's from England. But the more I've read his stuff, the more it really is really good. He's written a lot of books. And he was listed at one time as the 100th most influential man in the world because of his position and his teaching and his writing. But he said this in the sermon, and as I read it, I thought, wow, this sounds like us today in the United States in 2015. Let me read this to you. Now, the church is not persecuted so much as ignored. Its revolutionary message has been reduced to a toothless creed for bourgeois suburbanites. Nobody opposes it any longer because really there's nothing to oppose. My own conviction, for what it's worth, is that if we Christians were to compromise less, we would undoubtedly suffer more. If we were to hold fast the old-fashioned gospel of Christ, crucified for sinners, and of salvation as an absolutely free and undeserved gift, then the cross would become a stumbling block to the proud. If we were to maintain the high moral standards of Jesus, of uncorruptible honesty and integrity, of chastity before marriage and fidelity in it, and of costly sacrificial love, then there would be a public outcry that the church would return to Puritanism. If we were to dare once more to talk plainly about the alternatives of life and death, salvation and judgment, heaven and hell, then the world would rise up against an anger at such old-fashioned rubbish. Physical violence, imprisonment, and death may not be the fate of Christians in the West today. But faithfulness to Christ will, without doubt, bring ridicule and ostracism. This should not surprise us, however, for we are followers of the suffering of Christ. That just hit me very strongly, that part of what we deal with in the world today is that we're not, as Christians, persecuted, we're ignored. The Christian voice is no longer part of the equation to solve the world's problems. You know, what God wants doesn't ever factor in. And then part of it is that we've become complacent, I think, with the cultures we're in, and we're just not speaking out. And we're really not presenting the gospel in its truest, purest form. That there is an ethic to living the life of a Christian. There are certain things that we do and certain things that we don't do in following Christ in our cross-bearing lifestyle. But when the church looks like the culture around it, and the people sitting in the pews embrace the culture around it, what is there to be upset about? What does the world have to protest about? So maybe when we each individually get better at cross-bearing and following the principles that we're called to live, we'll raise a stink and a stir in the world. Because we're an indictment against it. I want to go on to the text as our time permits. Remember, it's getting really, really tense here. Peter doesn't like the attention. He doesn't like the future that's been pointed out to him, that he's going to be helpless in what's going to happen to him. So he turns to John, and John identifies himself pretty well. The one that Jesus loved, who leaned on his breast at supper and said, Lord, who is it that betrayed you? Then Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, but Lord, what about this man? Peter saying, what about John? I want the attention off me. What about John? And Jesus said to him, if I will to remain till I come, what is it to you? Follow me. This is really interesting because Peter, he's overwhelmed, and so he begins, tell me about John's future. And really Jesus tells Peter that John's personal cross has nothing to do with the cross that Peter's asked to bear. Sometimes you may be living the Christian life and you're doing your very best. You look at your neighbor sitting next to you, the person that sits in church next to you, well, they've got a lot easier than I've got. Why do I have it so hard? Why do I have to deal with these crazy people in my family that act the fool? Why do I have to deal with these people at work that just don't do things don't do? Why do I have to deal with the people at school who just aren't not good to me? Then Jesus says, it's about you. It's personal. Take it personal. It is personal. But your cross is your cross to bear. Peter can't deflect to John. Jesus says, you follow me. Don't worry about his follow. He follows me. You follow me. We're doing it a different way. Very often when we feel it's not fair, we feel that way when we're asked to do more than others. We may be feeling that way when we're asked to put up with more than others. You know, newsflash, this world is not fair. Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble, but be of good cheer. I've overcome the world. It's not fair. It's not fair maybe that you work at work and you're the most honest and person full of integrity that works there, and you see people who cut corners and do sort of shady things and they're getting ahead and you're not. Or it's not fair when you take a test at school and you keep your eyes on your... I know I'm talking about school a lot because that's where I'm headed to, okay? But you keep your eyes on your paper and you do your own work and you're struggling to make a C in math. That's my experience. And someone else is cheating and making an A. And you say, it's not fair. Guess what? It's not fair. But that may be your cross to bear. The injustice and equity, unfairness in the world may be your personal issue that you're bearing with. We can't look at what someone else has got or don't have in the spiritual world and say, well, what about them? You know, what about John? And Jesus, it's not about John. It's about you. You follow me. This is the third time I did once when I called you from the nets. Did a minute ago, and I do it again. Follow me. Personal discipleship is not about fairness. It's about faithfulness. Faithfulness. That's what it's about. It's not about fairness. It's about faithfulness. And I know that sometimes in the body of believers, you're good folk. We're good folk. And sometimes we feel overwhelmed and overburdened because it feels like no one else is doing anything. You know, the 80-20 rule. 20% of the people do 80% of the work. And you feel that way. And you thought, well, this is not fair. And Jesus says, put on your big boy panties or breeches or whatever the case may be. It's big girl panties and big boy breeches. Okay. Yeah. You got a little mixed up there. See, the world affects you. Okay. It's not about fairness. It's about faithfulness. If you're doing it for other people, you're doing it for the wrong motive. If you're doing it for me, we're good. It's about faithfulness, not fairness. That's what Peter is having to learn. Peter, it's about faithfulness, not fairness. Personal discipleship is what it is. Jesus says to him, you follow me. Don't be sweating John. You follow me. Now, if John don't give you a cliffhanger, John says, now listen, truth is, if everything that Jesus had did in his life was written down in books, he said, I don't think the whole world could even handle it. The whole world could not contain the thing. That was just 3 years. And don't get excited because I'm not preaching from Revelation next. I'll leave that up to Charles. John ends his gospel. And as far as we know, that is the last thing he wrote until, as an old man, he is in Patmos in exile. And it's Sunday morning. I don't know if the sun was shining like this, but he said it's Sunday morning. He said it is the Lord's day. And the Lord shows up. Big time. And he tells him things. He's got some more work. I need you to write some letters for me. We've got 7 churches out here who need to act up, change their ways. Some of them need to be encouraged. Some of them need to be told a few things. And then Jesus pulls back the curtain. And John sees everything. He sees everything. He sees heaven. He sees earth. He sees the past. He sees the future. He sees everything. And he ends it in the last chapter of the book of Revelation with invitation. He said, the Spirit and the bride say, come. Let him who thirsts come, that he may drink of the waters of life freely. So, in this life, whose disciple are you? I said something last week, and I really do believe it. I think there's a lot of fans of Jesus. And people like Jesus, you know. He would probably have a lot of likes on Facebook. If Jesus had a Facebook, he'd probably have a lot of likes. But there's a difference between being a fan of Jesus and a disciple of Jesus. Discipleship's a personal thing that you're going to have a cross to bear, and it's going to seem difficult at times, it's going to seem unfair at times, and it's going to seem almost incredibly hard. If you're having that experience, good. It means you're trying. As John Stott says, the problem with the church today is we've become ignored, not persecuted. The challenge of it is to live Christ-like enough that we make a ripple in the world. And the moral conscience and fabric of the people around us, that people are somewhat shocked. That we say, yeah, you shouldn't have sex before you get married. And by the way, marriage is between a man and a woman. And by the way, there is no other salvation except for through Jesus and by being his child. Any other mumbo jumbo out there? It's not a way to God. It's the strong delusion that God sent for people who wanted to read the lie more than the truth. And by the way, I'm going to be at church. If you find me missing, that's where I'll be. If you're here this morning, we can assist you in your personal decision. Brother Chris is going to lead us in a song. We're glad to pray with you, for you. Love this morning to assist someone in becoming a child of God, being baptized in Jesus, and become his disciple. If you're here this morning, won't you come as we stand and sing this song?